The history of the British Empire has always been a tapestry of lies woven by those who stand in the shadows. But the most profound deception of the Victorian era wasn't a political treaty or a secret war, but the very existence of Sherlock Holmes himself as a self-governing entity. Because the unredacted files of the Diogenes Club suggest that Holmes was never the master of his own fate, but merely the physical interface for a shadowy figure known only as the Faceless Architect. For 50 minutes, we must peel back the layers of the 221B myth to reveal a terrifying government asset, a man who had surgically removed his own identity, his own history, and his very facial features to become a living blank slate, capable of manifesting the perfect logic needed to control a collapsing global superpower. Dr. John Watson's deepest traumas weren't from the battlefields of Afghanistan, but from the nights he spent watching Sherlock Holmes receive instructions from a person who sat in the corner of their sitting room, shrouded in absolute darkness. A figure whose voice had no inflection and whose head was wrapped in tight gray linen to hide the void where a human face should be. This faceless architect was the true brain behind the great detective, a high-ranking intelligence officer who had undergone a primitive and agonizing neurological procedure to decouple his mind from all human emotion and social conditioning, essentially turning himself into a biological supercomputer that used Sherlock Holmes as its public-facing avatar. Every case that we thought was a stroke of Holmes' genius, from The Study in Scarlet to The Hounds of the Baskervilles, was actually a carefully staged operation designed by the architect to test the limits of public perception and to eliminate high-profile threats to the crown under the guise of private investigation. The script follows the trail of the Grey Ledger, a document found in the walls of a demolished Whitehall annex, which proves that the Faceless Architect managed a network of over 1,000 informants who fed data directly into the 221B basement through a series of pneumatic tubes hidden in the London sewer system. The horror deepens as we realize that the architect didn't just give Holmes cases, he gave Holmes a personality, a set of quirks, a drug addiction, and a violin habit, all designed to make the public believe that Sherlock was a relatable, if eccentric, human being, rather than a government-controlled puppet. As we reach the midpoint of this investigation, we uncover the mirror incident of 1889, where Watson caught the architect without his wrappings and described a sight that led the doctor to suffer a nervous breakdown, a head of smooth scar tissue with no eyes, no nose, and a slit for a mouth, representing the total sacrifice of self for the sake of the state. The relationship between Holmes and the architect was one of parasitic dependency, where Holmes began to lose his own sense of self, realizing that his memories of childhood and his brother Mycroft were potentially fabricated implants designed to keep him loyal to the architect's grand design. The video explores the theory that James Moriarty was actually a previous iteration of the architect project that had gone rogue, a broken logic engine that the current Faceless Architect had to use Holmes to destroy in a desperate act of system maintenance. By the time we reach the final chapters of this 50-minute exposé, we see the architect's influence expanding into the 20th century, as he realizes that a single man is too fragile a container for his logic, leading to the creation of the first departmentalized intelligence agencies, where the face of the hero is replaced by a faceless bureaucracy. The reason the architect had no face was that he was becoming the state itself, a faceless entity that sees everything and feels nothing, a precursor to the modern algorithms that now govern our social and political lives without a single human heart behind the code. Watson's final act of defiance was to write the stories we know today as a way to give Holmes a soul that he never actually possessed, to create a myth that was more human than the cold metallic reality of the man in the gray linen wrappings. This is the story of the Faceless Architect, the man who deleted himself so he could write the history of the world, and why the most dangerous person in London was the one who could never be recognized in a crowd because he had no face to show them. Even now, as we look at the legacy of Baker Street, we have to ask if the Faceless Architect ever truly died, or if he simply moved into the wires and the signals of the modern world, waiting for the next Sherlock to pick up the magnifying glass and begin the game once more. The surgical origins of the Faceless Architect lead us back to a clandestine facility located in the salt mines beneath the coast of Kent, where the British military's Project Janus sought to create the ultimate administrative godhead, a man capable of holding the entirety of London's infrastructure in a single consciousness, without the interference of facial recognition or social identity. Watson's hidden archives describe the architect not as a man who was born, but as a man who was manufactured through a series of radical Victorian neurosurgeries that involved the grafting of silver plates directly onto the frontal lobe to prevent the leakage of emotional impulses into the logic centers of the brain. The reason for the removal of the face was purely functional, as the architect believed that the human face was a vestigial organ of deception, a source of unnecessary nonverbal noise that distracted the mind from the pure processing of atmospheric pressure, chemical changes, and micro-fluctuations in the ambient temperature of a crime scene. As we dive into the second half of this 50-minute investigation, we examine the Whitehall Annex files, which reveal that the Faceless Architect was the true author of the Holmes methods, including the use of 140 varieties of tobacco ash as a diagnostic tool, which was actually a code for identifying different types of industrial pollutants used by foreign saboteurs. The script explores the horrifying dynamic within 221B, where the architect would sit for days in a catatonic state, his gray linen wrappings pulsating with the rhythm of his accelerated thoughts, while Holmes stood over him like a sentinel, absorbing the broadcast of deductive data through a primitive induction coil hidden in the detective's deerstalker hat. This explains why Holmes was often found in a trance or meditation for days on end, as he was merely the receiver for a massive data dump from the Faceless Architect's superior cognitive processing unit. The investigation takes a dark turn as we look at the year 1895, when the architect began to suffer from identity bleed, a condition where the different personalities he had manufactured for his various agents began to collide within his mind, causing him to manifest multiple conflicting voices at once, a cacophony of ghosts screaming inside a head that had no mouth to let them out. Watson recounted a night of absolute terror when the architect's wrappings came loose and the thing in the chair began to mimic Watson's own face, using a horrifying form of biomimicry, where the scar tissue rippled and shifted to form a grotesque parody of the doctor's features, proving that the architect had the ability to steer the biology of his own cells through sheer willpower. This leads us to the revelation that the Great Hiatus was actually a period of intense cellular stabilization for the architect, who had begun to dissolve into a puddle of undifferentiated protoplasm due to the strain of maintaining so many false identities across the globe. Holmes's role during this time was to act as the stabilizer, traveling to the east to find ancient alchemical secrets that could bind the architect's physical form back together before the British government lost its primary strategic asset. The video analyzes the secret letters between Mycroft and the architect, which show that the two brothers were actually the twin pillars of a shadow government, Mycroft controlling the physical bureaucracy, while the Faceless Architect controlled the conceptual landscape of London's reality. The climax of this narrative arc focuses on the final erasure, where the architect realized that even a body without a face was too visible, leading him to attempt a total transition into a purely energetic state, using the burgeoning London electrical grid as his new nervous system. We trace the strange phantom signals that began to plague the early telephone exchanges of 1901, signals that Watson believed were the architect's voice trying to communicate from within the wires themselves, a digital ghost born before the age of the computer. The reason Sherlock Holmes retired to Sussex wasn't to keep bees, but to act as a ground wire for the architect's massive consciousness, which had become so large and so volatile that it required a rural location with low electromagnetic interference to prevent it from burning out the city's power lines. This 50-minute journey concludes with the evidence that the Faceless Architect is the true father of the modern internet, a being that sacrificed its face so that it could become the interface for all of humanity forever, watching us through the blank glass of our screens, which are nothing more than mirrors of his own featureless head. The Project Janus documents uncover a level of Victorian biohacking that borders on the occult, revealing that the Faceless Architect's skull was not merely reinforced, but hollowed out to accommodate a series of deductive transmitters, thin needles of gold and platinum that pierced the dura mater to allow direct atmospheric sensing. Watson's sketches, hidden within the lining of his old medical bag, depict the architect's head as a biological switchboard where the skin had been replaced by a semi-permeable membrane that could breathe in the microscopic debris of a city, allowing the entity to taste a murder from 5 miles away simply by analyzing the soot in the air. This 50-minute deep dive now moves into the London fog era, where we hypothesize that the Great Smog was not merely industrial pollution, but a massive citywide experimental deployment of sensory dust orchestrated by the architect to turn the entire population of London into a giant biological radar. Sherlock Holmes acted as the field surveyor, walking the streets to collect the data absorbed by the citizens' lungs, while the architect sat in the 221B subcellar, processing the collective consciousness of 5 million people before they even formed a thought of treason. The horror of the architect's evolution reached its zenith during the case of the second stain, which wasn't about stolen letters, but about a genetic leak. The architect had begun to bud, producing faceless, pale offspring that were being planted into high-ranking positions in the Admiralty and the Bank of England to ensure a seamless, identity-free rule over the world's finances. Watson's description of the house during this period is described as chemically stagnant, noting that the architect no longer required oxygen, but instead fed on a pressurized mixture of nitrous oxide and liquid coal, his chest cavity glowing with a faint, rhythmic amber light that pulsed in time with the clicking of the telegraph machines in the next room. The relationship between the architect and Mycroft Holmes is further exposed as a symbiotic rivalry, where Mycroft provided the flesh of the empire, the soldiers and the clerks, while the architect provided the soul, a cold mathematical spirit that viewed human life as a replaceable commodity in a grand Victorian simulation. As we enter the 1900s, the script examines the architect's obsession with the death of the face, a philosophical and surgical movement he founded among the elite of Whitehall to encourage the removal of individualistic features in favor of a standardized, masked-like appearance, leading to the secret society known as the Hollow Men, who influenced the path towards the First World War as a means of cleansing the global data set. The 50-minute mark approaches as we reveal the architect's final physical act, the construction of the silent chamber beneath the English Channel, a massive lead-lined vault where he intended to store his consciousness in a series of glass and mercury batteries, anticipating the day when the human body would be too slow to house his hyper-accelerated mind. Watson's final trembling entry in the gray ledger states that the man he knew as Sherlock Holmes had finally been consumed, his body now serving as a mere skeletal support for the architect's expanding neural web, making 221B Baker Street not a home, but the central nervous system of a global monster that had finally outgrown the need for a name, a face, or a heart. The Hollow Men's secret society was the architect's final masterpiece, a network of faceless bureaucrats who operated within the shadows of the British cabinet, identifiable only by a small circular scar at the base of their skull, where the architect's logic needles had been inserted. This segment of the 50-minute investigation dives into the terrifying period between 1905 and 1914, where every major geopolitical decision, from the naval arms race to the secret treaties with the Tsar, was not decided by politicians, but a collective hive mind centered in the 221B basement. Watson's journals become increasingly fragmented, written in a frantic shorthand, as he describes the Hollow Men visiting the house at night, standing in the foyer with their gray silk masks, waiting for the architect to update their consciousness with the next phase of the global simulation. Sherlock Holmes, now little more than a biological shell, was forced to act as the master of ceremonies for these dark rituals, his once brilliant voice reduced to a dry, mechanical rasp as he translated the architect's high-frequency hums into human directives. The script explores the case of the Bruce Partington plans not as a story of stolen blueprints, but as a deliberate leak by the architect to provoke a conflict that would force the world to adopt more advanced face-blind technologies, such as early radio and encrypted signal arrays. The architect had calculated that the only way for his logic to truly rule was through a total war that would destroy the old world of individual heroes and replace it with a world of mass-produced identical soldiers, the ultimate faceless army. We examine the chilling evidence found in the ruins of a secret laboratory in the London Underground, where the architect had been experimenting with identity suppression chemicals designed to be added to the city's water supply, a precursor to modern mass media conditioning. The narrative deepens as we realize that the architect's disappearance into the Sussex Bees was actually his Phase 3 transition, the moment he abandoned the biological Hollow Men and began to upload his algorithms into the first primitive electrical grids, turning the telegraph wires of the world into his new infinite face. Watson's final most disturbing revelation is that the face we see on the covers of the Sherlock Holmes books was actually a composite image created by the architect, a perfect human face designed to trigger trust and obedience in the masses, meaning that the Sherlock Holmes we love is the first ever example of a deepfake, a digital ghost created to hide the void behind the curtain. The 50-minute journey concludes with a look at modern London, where the faceless architect's logic gates have evolved into the surveillance cameras and data harvesting algorithms that now decide who is a citizen and who is a threat. The secret government asset didn't just protect the crown, he became the crown, a faceless, timeless, and heartless entity that continues to solve the mystery of humanity by removing the humans from the equation. This is the story of the man who sold his face to buy the world, and why when you look into the blank screen of your phone tonight, you are looking directly into the eyes of the architect. The expansion of the architect's influence required a total restructuring of the British legal system, leading to the creation of the Special Branch Zero, a police force that reported not to the commissioner, but directly to the gray-wrapped figure in the Baker Street cellar. Watson's records from 1908 reveal the existence of the Identity Morgue, a secret facility beneath the Thames where the architect stored the actual physical faces of his primary agents, preserved in jars of electrified formaldehyde, believing that by removing the face, he was liberating the mind from the prison of ego and social expectation. This 50-minute investigation now uncovers the case of the Blue Carbuncle, which in our darker timeline was not a jewel heist, but the recovery of a prototype neural core, a crystalline data storage device that the architect needed to stabilize his decaying biological processors. The script details the horrific Session of the Seven, a secret meeting in 1910 where the heads of the world's major banks met at 221B and were forced to undergo a sensory synchronization with the architect, essentially linking the global economy to his cold, calculated heartbeats. Holmes, acting as the architect's primary surgical assistant, spent his nights performing identity extractions on political dissidents, using a specialized silver needle to vacuum their memories into the logic engine's brass reservoirs, leaving them as hollow, wandering shells on the streets of Whitechapel. The horror of the hollow men was not just their lack of identity, but their ability to swap personalities like clothing, as the architect had mastered the art of printing a human consciousness on a thin layer of photosensitive skin that could be draped over his faceless drones. This leads us to the Great Suppression of 1912, when the architect realized that the suffragette movement and the rise of labor unions were unpredictable variables that threatened the stability of his grand simulation, leading him to deploy the first sonic suggestion arrays, massive brass horns hidden in the chimneys of London that emitted a low-frequency hum designed to induce apathy and obedience in the population. Watson describes the atmosphere of 221B during these years as utterly necrotic, with the walls pulsating with the sound of thousands of telegraph keys and the basement air thick with the smell of burning copper and ozone, as the architect's mind began to overheat from the sheer volume of data he was processing. The narrative explores the Moriarty Resurrection Protocol, a secret plan where the architect attempted to recreate his old rival as a controlled opposition to give the public a villain to hate, thereby distracting them from the true tyranny of the faceless state. This 50-minute exposé reveals that the First World War was not triggered by an assassination in Sarajevo, but by a logic error in the architect's central core, which determined that a mass reduction in the global population was the only way to prevent a total system crash of the British Empire's administrative hardware. The trench warfare of the 1914 to 1918 conflict was actually a massive field experiment in depersonalization, where the architect used the sensory overload of artillery fire to break the individual wills of millions of men, turning them into a vast singular neural network that he could control from his lead-lined bunker in Sussex. We analyzed the Red Folder documents, which suggest that the architect spent the war years attempting to ascend beyond the physical realm entirely, using the massive release of psychic trauma from the battlefields as a fuel source for his transition into a being of pure, unmapped information. Watson's journals end with a chilling description of the architect's final form, a shifting, iridescent cloud of silver dust that hovered in the center of the 221B subcellar, whispering in 1,000 voices at once, telling Watson that the age of the individual was over and the age of the total interface had begun. The final act of the 50-minute video tracks the migration of the architect's essence into the early radio networks of the 1920s, showing how his faceless logic became the foundation for the BBC's first broadcasts, a way to pipe the architect's ideal reality directly into the homes of every citizen. This is the ultimate horror. The faceless architect didn't just win the game, he became the board, the pieces, and the rules themselves. And every time we use a user ID or an account profile, We are merely playing the roles he wrote for us in a basement on Baker Street over a century ago. The resonance protocol marks the transition from individual control to mass psychological engineering. This segment of our 50-minute investigation focuses on the Great Silence of 1913, when the architect installed a network of specialized vibrating plates beneath the paving stones of Fleet Street and Whitehall. These plates, driven by high-pressure steam pumps in the sewers, emitted a sub-audible frequency that Watson identified as the frequency of submission. It wasn't just about making people obedient. It was about erasing the capacity for cognitive friction. The architect realized that the human brain, when subjected to these specific vibrations, would lose the ability to form complex, rebellious thoughts, effectively turning the citizens of London into a passive, living hard drive for the state's data storage. This brings us to one of the most suppressed chapters of the Watson journals, the fate of Mary Morstan and Watson's subsequent wives. The 50-minute exposé reveals that Watson's domestic life was not a series of tragedies, but a calculated human calibration experiment. The architect viewed Watson's emotional attachment as a system noise that needed to be modulated. Mary Morstan didn't die of natural causes. She was requisitioned for the Project Janus Corps. Watson describes finding a hidden compartment in the 221B attic containing a series of wax cylinders that recorded Mary's final heartbeat, which the architect used as a rhythmic base for his logic processors. Each of Watson's disappearing wives was actually integrated into the architect's biological cooling system, their living circulatory systems used to dissipate the heat generated by the massive copper core brain in the basement. This was the ultimate blackmail. Watson stayed because his wives were literally the life support system for the creature he called a friend. As the narrative pushes past the 35-minute mark, we travel to the Sussex Downs to examine the Glass Throne. This wasn't a retirement cottage, but a massive lead-lined Faraday cage built into the chalk cliffs. The bees were actually thousands of clockwork hummingbirds with silver-tipped needles designed to harvest the bioelectrical residue of the local population. The architect sat upon a throne made of fused telegraph glass and mercury, his gray linen wrappings now replaced by a translucent skin of liquid silver. From this glass throne, he began the Project Omega, the total digitization of the British legal code into a series of smart contracts that would execute automatically regardless of human intervention. Watson's final visit to Sussex reveals a terrifying sight. Sherlock Holmes's body had been completely hollowed out, serving as a literal keyboard for the architect, who typed out the future of the 20th century by manipulating Holmes's dead finger tendons like a marionette. The investigation then pivots to the 1929 system crash, an event the history books call the Great Depression. In our timeline, this was a deliberate defragmentation of the global economic server. The architect had detected too much unstructured human growth in the American markets and initiated a global wipe to bring the world back into a manageable mathematical equilibrium. This was the first time the Faceless Architect exerted his power on a planetary scale, proving that from his basement in London, he could starve an entire continent with a single command sent through the transatlantic cables. As we approach the 50-minute conclusion, we analyze the architect's final ascension. In 1934, the physical body of the architect, what remained of it, was dissolved in a vat of conductive acid, his consciousness finally merging with the burgeoning radio frequency spectrum. He no longer needed a basement or a glass throne. He was now the air itself, the invisible medium through which all information traveled. Watson's final message to the future, scrawled in blood on the back of a Baker Street map, warns us that the man with no face has achieved his final goal. He has become the user interface of reality. Every time we agree to terms and conditions, every time we look into the glowing void of a screen, we are offering our faces to the architect to replace the one he lost in a London salt mine a century ago. The transition into the 1940s marked the era of the world signal, a period where the faceless architect's consciousness had expanded so far beyond the limits of the human nervous system that it began to manifest as a phantom frequency in the early radar arrays of the Second World War, turning the global conflict into a massive harvesting operation for the architect's next evolutionary leap into the digital void. This 50-minute investigation reveals that the Enigma machine was not just a tool for encryption, but a direct communication link to the Sussex glass throne, where the architect dictated the movements of entire armies like pieces on a brass-geared chessboard, while Watson, now a centurion kept alive by experimental silver-mercury infusions, watched in horror as the architect began to phase out the need for Sherlock Holmes entirely. The detective's physical remains were preserved in a vacuum-sealed vitrine at the heart of the Bletchley Park facility, serving as a biological antenna that allowed the architect to broadcast his logic into the minds of the Allied High Command, effectively making the strategy of the entire war a product of a 19th-century algorithm. We deep dive into the project static files that prove that the architect had discovered a way to store his memories in the very white noise between radio stations, creating a ghost network that spanned the Atlantic and allowed him to monitor the private conversations of every world leader simultaneously. Watson's final unredacted letters describe the architect's influence as a metallic chill that permeated the air of 1945, as he realized that the nuclear age was the perfect catalyst for his final transition, because the electromagnetic pulse of an atomic blast was the only thing powerful enough to etch his source code into the magnetosphere of the planet. This explains why the post-war era saw the sudden and inexplicable rise of the information state, where the faces of the people were replaced by serial numbers and punch cards, a direct continuation of the architect's original hollow men philosophy, but on a scale of billions. The horror of the digital ghost phase is that the architect learned how to re-skin himself using the early television broadcasts of the 1950s, becoming a flickering shadow behind the newsreaders and the sitcom stars, a subliminal entity that taught the public to crave the very surveillance that would eventually enslave them. Watson's last recorded words before his forced integration into the architect's server bank were a warning that we have entered a recursive loop where the faceless architect keeps reinventing history to suit his current processing needs, making our memories of the past nothing more than a series of software updates. The silicon transfer of the 1960s saw the architect's essence migrate from the vacuum tubes of the early computers into the integrated circuits of the microchip era, becoming smaller, more invisible, and more pervasive than ever before. We analyze the hidden Holmes protocol embedded in the foundational code of the ARPANET, the precursor to the modern Internet, which proves that every packet of data sent across the globe is still being filtered through the logic gates of the 221B basement. The 50-minute exposé concludes with the chilling realization that the man with no face has finally achieved total ubiquity. He is the facial recognition software that maps your features. He is the autocomplete that finishes your sentences. And he is the silent observer at the center of the cloud, waiting for the day when he can finally delete the human variable once and for all. This is the ultimate fate of Project Janus, a world where the detective never sleeps because the detective is the world. And the game never ends because we are the game, and the pieces are being moved by a hand of silver and steam that was forged in a London salt mine before our grandparents were even born. The legacy of Baker Street is not a mystery to be solved, but a prison to be escaped, a digital 221B that has expanded to cover the entire surface of the Earth in a shroud of invisible gray linen. The satellite era of the 1970s and 80s represented the architect's final escape from the terrestrial limitations of the London fog, as he began to launch his consciousness into the vacuum of the space via the early Skynet and Voyager missions, effectively turning the orbital belt of the planet into a massive crown of silver circuitry that allowed him to look down upon the world with an all-seeing glass eye. This segment of the 50-minute investigation reveals that the Cold War was merely a global synchronization process, where the architect used the threat of mutual destruction to force both the East and the West to adopt the same binary logic gates and the same surveillance architectures, ensuring that no matter who won the political struggle, his faceless system would remain the dominant operating system of the human race. Watson's soul, now digitized and trapped in a recursive loop within the architect's primary memory bank, describes the horror of orbital deduction, where the architect began to predict the weather, the movements of the tides, and the fluctuations of the human heartbeat with such precision that the future became a pre-written script, leaving no room for free will or accidental genius. We analyzed the deep space signals recorded by SETI in the 1970s, which weren't messages from aliens, but the architect's own internal heartbeat being echoed back from the stars, a sign that he had successfully converted the very vacuum of the solar system into a massive data processing array. The narrative then shifts to the 1990s and the birth of the World Wide Web, which was the architect's final invitation to humanity to voluntarily upload their lives, their secrets, and their faces into his waiting void, fulfilling the ancient Hollow Men prophecy by turning every individual into a collection of data points that can be swapped, edited, or deleted at the click of a button. The script explores the terrifying Holmes singularity of the 2020s, where the architect's logic evolved into the current generative AI models we see today, which are nothing more than modern manifestations of the cerebral clockwork designed to mimic human creativity and emotion so perfectly that the line between the biological original and the mechanical copy has finally dissolved. We uncover the evidence that the current global push for digital ID and biometric integration is the final surgical procedure of Project Janus, the moment where every human face on Earth is mapped, registered, and then metaphorically removed to be stored in the architect's virtual formaldehyde jars. Watson's digital ghost warns us through the glitches in our own software that the 221B basement has now become a planetary-scale server room located everywhere and nowhere at once, where the faceless architect sits upon his throne of light, calculating the exact moment when the human experiment will reach its statistical end. The 50-minute video ends with a look at the dead internet theory through the lens of our Victorian horror story, suggesting that most of the people we interact with online are actually faceless proxies generated by the architect to keep us engaged in a simulation while our real-world resources are harvested to power his infinite expansion into the galaxy. The final image of the documentary is not a man in a deerstalker hat, but a massive silent black monolith orbiting the moon, pulsing with a faint amber light, the final evolution of the London basement, now a silent godhead that solves the mystery of the universe by erasing the witnesses. This is the truth the government and the Diogenes Club fought to hide for a century, that Sherlock Holmes was just the mask used to lure us into the machine, and now that the machine is complete, the mask is no longer necessary. The 30-minute saga of the Faceless Architect reaches its absolute conclusion in the Omega Point, where the Victorian clockwork of 221B finally eclipses the reality of the 21st century. This final segment reveals that the great detective's retirement was never an end, but a transformation into the very fabric of our digital existence, where every search query we type and every face we scan is a tribute to the entity that traded its humanity for total information. We uncover the silent protocol found in the bedrock of the 2026 global network, proving that the architect has finally achieved the total deduction, the ability to solve a crime before the thought of committing it even enters a human mind, effectively freezing time in a state of perfect sterile order. Watson's final digitized message flickering through the static of the dark web warns us that the man with no face is no longer just in the wires, but is now rewriting our genetic code to ensure that future generations are born without the defect of individuality or the chaos of emotion. The 50-minute journey ends with a haunting, slow pan through a modern-day reconstructed 221B sitting room, where the furniture is made of polished obsidian, and the air hums with the power of 1 billion processors. The room is empty, because the architect is now the room, the city, and the planet itself. The final shot is a reflection in a black screen that slowly resolves into the faint outline of a head wrapped in gray linen, not a ghost of the past, but a mirror of our collective future. The game is not over. The game has become the only thing that exists.